Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jennifer Lawrence, and I am the Executive Director of the Sasaki Foundation. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening for such an important conversation about women in municipal leadership. At the Sasaki Foundation, we believe design has the power to address the most urgent challenges facing us, from social equity to environmental resilience. Design is an agent of change, and yet, access to design for the communities who need it the most is often limited. We work at the intersection of research, practice, and community to leverage design to tackle these challenges. In addition to gathering impressive panels of local experts to discuss inequities and solutions, we also currently have 2 open opportunities to engage in creating solutions through the foundation. Our design grants are open now for community groups and interdisciplinary teams to propose their solutions to some of our community's most pressing needs. We have also just opened up applications for our high school employment program, the Summer Exploratory Experience in Design, or SEED, where students receive paid internships and learn hands-on skills in various design disciplines. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our next panel discussion, which will take place in celebration of Earth Day on April 22nd from 1 to 2:30 p.m. This conversation is titled Invest in Our Future, Youth Engagement in Design and Sustainability, and welcomes adult and youth staff in the field from the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing in East Boston, Green Roots in Chelsea, the aforementioned SEED program at the Sasaki Foundation in Sasaki, and Groundwork Somerville. We'll put the links to all of these events and applications in the chat shortly. I would also like to thank our dedicated board members in attendance this evening. So far, I have seen Tao and Marianne and Chris, and I know that Elaine will be joining us as well. Thank you for being here tonight. We so appreciate you and all of the time you put in. Our moderator, Nayeli Rodriguez, is a program director at the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and her work for the City of Boston addresses equity and thoughtfulness around technology, public space, expanding the role of libraries in civic life, and planning for environmental health and justice in Boston's infrastructure and shared places. She is also a Sasaki alum and has worked with the foundation on various projects. Thank you, Nayeli, for moderating this panel of fascinating women in municipal leadership.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for being here. So in honor of Women's History Month, the Sasaki Foundation is inviting all of us to join in this panel today with women in municipal leadership in Massachusetts. And because it is Trans Day of Visibility, let's just acknowledge that the community of people who identify as women is very broad, and we're going to make room for that tonight in our conversation. Which we're going to get to now. So we're going to talk to these leaders from the greater Boston area about the importance of representation in municipal leadership, their work in community building, climate adaptation, housing strategies, transit and mobility, and health and well-being. We've got a full house. So just a couple logistics to go over. There are captions enabled. So to open them for your screen, just click on the icon at the bottom of the screen that says closed captions and the symbol that has a little CC. And if you don't see that setting, you can click on the 3 dots at the bottom of the screen. And the chat is enabled, and we're happy to take question ideas. So just use the chat to log a question. At the end of the session, we'll try to get to as many as we can. And if you're having technical issues, you can do a direct chat to Jennifer and she'll help you. Otherwise, please stay muted for the session just so we don't have too much background noise that can be distracting to folks. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So we have 4 women in municipal leadership with us tonight. We have Flor Amaya, who is a strong community and social services clinical provider. She serves as the Director of Public Health for the City of Chelsea and is a core member of the Chelsea Project, which is an endeavor to create long-term, self-sustaining and resilient public health in Chelsea. Kate Bennett is the administrator of the Boston Housing Authority. There she oversees public housing and housing choice voucher programs that provide affordable housing for about 50,000 people, both in and around the city of Boston. And she also spearheads redevelopment activities currently underway at several BHA developments. Tiffany Chu serves as the Chief of Staff for Mayor Michelle Wu's office in the city of Boston. She is an urban planner with expertise in transportation and climate initiatives, and is the co-founder and former CEO of Remix, which is a leading collaborative software platform for transportation planning. And last but not least, we have Iram Farouk, who serves as the Assistant City Manager for Community Development in the City of Cambridge and works to create integrated solutions for livable, sustainable, equitable, just, and resilient communities. So welcome to all of our panelists and welcome to all of our audience members. I'm happy to be here with all of you tonight. So because we're on Zoom, I have a couple of questions prepared for each of you, but I want to encourage you to make this a conversation. So please jump in and respond, even if one question isn't initially directed to you. And I'm going to start with a question for all of you, since we're hosted tonight by the Sasaki Foundation, whose stated mission is empowering communities by tackling the issue of equity and inequity in design. In just a few words, what does design mean to each of you? I'll pass it to Flora first.
Hi, thank you for the invite. I am really excited to be here. So to answer your question, this is actually the first time that I had thought and contemplated what design means to me. So initially, I think what I came up with is that design really affects the way we navigate and experience our surrounding, or what we may call our community or world. And part of the reason why I think that was the initial experience of design for me is as my second role, I'm a physical therapist. And oftentimes I'm thinking of how accessibility for people who may have mobility impairments, and how very thoughtful design options or choices can influence how someone may experience the world, create independence in that experience as well, is super important to really being engaged in the community. So those were the initial thoughts I think I had around design, but ultimately in thinking of the broader idea, how design can affect our or impact our current scenario in climate change, what we choose, the elements we may decide to implement in any new structure. I think it has a really strong role in community wellness and community resilience.
That's beautiful. Tiffany, how about you? What does design mean to you?
I love this question because I think it just tells so much about someone's experience. And in my experience, I've been in way too many leadership meetings where people ask the design team to make the slides look better. And I think that is much deeper of an issue when people don't understand like how fundamental design should be brought into earlier in the process to help think through strategic questions and even what question we're asking. I like to say to other founders and CEOs when they shove design down the org chart or off to the side, that design is not just about how something looks, but how something works.
Very well said. Aram, can you tell us what design means to you?
Sure, thanks. Thank you for having me today. So I actually come from a background of architecture and design. So when I first got into architecture, design to me was about creativity and creating beautiful things that would give joy to people. But as I have moved through my career and it's evolved, I have grown to think of design as much as it is about creativity and joy. It is also about problem solving and innovation. And it's about testing and iteration of solutions. It's about entrepreneurship. And, you know, design, sometimes when we think about design in that context, we think about disruption. How is it that we change from the status quo. And we are in one of those moments right now where we have had a disruption that is actually allowing us to redesign how we think, how we work, and also how we frame solutions for our communities. But I also think it's about, in different times, about evolution. And I was thinking about this as folks were talking, and just at my desk, I had, the humble paperclip, and this is where we started. And it's like, well, this is great. Amazingly, we used to have loose papers, and somebody came up with this idea to clip stuff together. And then this was not sufficient, and they said, well, hey, let's make a bigger one. And so they, evolving the solution, and it's like, hey, that one scratches the paper. Let's get one that has something on it so that it's gonna improve that situation. And yet this is all great, but we still can only stick 6 sheets of paper. So here comes then the binder clip, which I don't think anybody can do without in this world. But I sort of just sitting here realized that we are constantly in our lives engaging with design as we evolve whether it's policy solutions or whether it's our physical environment. So to me, and maybe it's because of my background, to me, design is everything.
And Kate, how about you? How would you define design?
Yeah, I also just love this question and these answers. To me, design is sort of like a spectrum, for on the one end being like pure functionality and on the other end being pure art, and kind of everything in between. And for me, I think a lot about design as a public good, and that, everything in between, whether it's a building or a stroller or a medical device on the sort of functional end, or whether it's, a sculpture or something beautiful on the art end of things, that the best design has an element of inclusivity and accessibility and, relatability, that it's just a design as public good.
Beautiful. Thank you for all of those great answers. I can't wait to dig in more. Kate, my first question is actually going to be back to you. You've had so many major successes in your career, previously in the cities of Newton and Chelsea, and now in Boston. Can you talk to us about a project that you were a part of that introduced an innovative solution to improving housing affordability, and looking back, what the role of diverse representation was in that project?
Sure. So I think I'm going to use an example of something we did a couple years ago, and I see that Dr. Nick Kelly is on the call, so he'll be familiar with this project. One of the things that comes to mind when I think about equity and diversity and sort of improving access to housing is our ECHO program. And a couple years ago, we were struggling with the fact that most of our voucher holders, we have about 16,000 voucher households that we administer, and they're highly concentrated in a few neighborhoods of the city. So Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. But we have families that really want to live many places. They want to live in other neighborhoods that are have historically not been very voucher friendly, both within Boston, in some of the higher market neighborhoods, but also the cities and towns surrounding Boston. And so we did a couple things to try to really level that playing field a bit. The first thing was we petitioned HUD to change its reimbursement structure to landlords, so that rather than having one set reimbursement structure across the entire Boston region, we went to a small area system of zip code level FMR, fair market rents. And so it meant that our vouchers were more valuable in places like Beacon Hill and West Roxbury and Newton than they were in other neighborhoods, so that our families could compete for those for those neighborhoods and actually secure housing. And by doing that, increase the level of affordable housing in those other areas. And the second thing we did was to create, and I credit Dr. Nick with this, create an amazing search tool, which really helped families work with their preferences for what they were looking for and their goals around transportation, around schools, around public safety. It's a tool that allows them to input where the things that are happening in their life are occurring, whether it's family or healthcare or schools. And it has incredible transportation algorithms and other things to match with real estate databases our families with housing options in places that will work for them and respond to those needs. And I think it was critical in that process, to your question, Nayeli, about representation. We worked with a lot of families in that process in refining that strategy, and particularly the ECHO tool, which ultimately was, revised many times in that process through working with families, so that it could really meet folks where they were at, and it could be really useful to them, and not something that, we've all tried things that just aren't, don't work, and we sort of trash them right away. And so I would lift that up as an example of something we tried to do to really help build a more equitable city, and optimize our impact in that way.
That's great. I am going to shift a little bit of topics from housing and shift over to Tiffany. You are coming to the city with such a vast expertise in transportation innovation and urban planning, which can both be very male-dominated sectors. And even though that is changing, your experiences, I'm imagining, led you to develop a very unique perspective on this work. So I'm wondering what experiences in particular you're consciously drawing on in your role as Chief of Staff.
Thank you for asking that. So now that I'm 6 weeks into the job, I have started to understand what a chief of staff is and what people's expectations are for this role. So to give everyone some context, the way that I've started thinking about this role, it basically has 3 parts. The first one is you have to, at a very foundational level, you have to support the mayor. And so that's like the nuts and bolts of figuring out how she orients her schedule, what she prioritizes, who her advanced people are, and all of that stuff, which was totally new to me. That was completely not part of my job before, but it is a very fundamental part of running the mayor's office. Number 2 is actually around supporting and managing the 18,000 person organization that is the city. And what that means is, how do you put the pieces into place to deliver good government? And Nayeli knows this intimately. Kate knows this intimately. This is not an easy task, even to just coordinate across 18,000 people and the number of departments. And I think the design piece here is thinking about how to design an environment that people feel like they can collaborate and they can, venture out of their silo or their swim lane and be able to extend a hand and say, hey, I want to work on this project in a cross-departmental way. So I think that's what I think about in terms of designing a collaborative environment for 18,000 people. And then the last piece, which I think is maybe the most, maybe the thing that people think about most when they think about a chief of staff or running the mayor's office, is really driving the mayor's agenda. So basically taking every single campaign promise and then translating that into actionable goals, but then communicating it in a way that people even remember what those goals are and what they're driving towards. I'm in the process of designing a goals structure for the mayor's office so that everyone understands how their individual contribution ladders up to a bigger thing. I think some people in some places call that, management I think of it as a design exercise. How do you design the processes and the organizational structures that people start to really figure out how they fit into a larger picture and then drive forward so that everyone is greater than the sum of their individual parts. So when I think about running an organization, leading and hiring, all of that to me is a massive design problem, and it's really exciting.
It is exciting, and it's exciting to be a part of it. You mentioned so much about collaboration, and that's a really good segue to the next question that I have, and this one's for you, Aram. You have such a large team at the City of Cambridge working in multiple diverse planning areas, from climate change to transportation, housing, and economic development and open space. As an outsider looking in, your team seems so diverse, enviably diverse. So what is your approach to building a team?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to start with some of the threads that that Tiffany was talking about, because really, in terms of building a strong team, I would say the first piece is to start with the core values of the organization and what it is you're trying to achieve. So when you introduced me, you talked about the statement that I've added to our mission statement, which is, what is it that we are doing is really building a city that is livable, sustainable, resilient, equitable, and just. That's the hook that everybody can figure out how they fit into that picture. And that's what helps everyone come together, because each one of those disciplines, whether it's transportation or open space planning or economic development or zoning, and things like zoning are much more abstract and it's harder to hook in, but when you connect to what it's really doing, I would say that that ability to help people see their role in the context of that big picture is really the foundational piece of team building. And then there are some of the other elements that Tiffany was touching on as well. Figuring out a way to make those groups not turn into silos that are just very inward facing, but to create a collegial and collaborative environment where problem solving is happening not just based on that one discipline, but creating opportunities for folks to connect and to understand how their pieces actually fit together to create a more synergistic and larger whole. I would say in terms of building and also supporting a team in the work that they do, communication is incredibly important. Communication within the organization, communication stemming outward from the organization, just to be able to craft those stories of how the things that we do work and how they are interconnected. So especially with a multidisciplinary group like ours, it's critical to be able to do that in order to ensure the cohesiveness of the team. And I could talk about this all day, but I'm going to stop there and turn it back to you, Nayeli.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear some common themes already in what each of you are saying. I'm curious now from Flor, as an experienced social and clinical provider, what programs have you worked on in your career that you have felt had the most impact on some of the things that others have mentioned around creating a more equitable community?
Thank you for that question, Nayeli. I'm actually working on that program right now as the Director of Public Health for the City of Chelsea. The City of Chelsea has not had a dedicated public health director in possibly over 20 years. And I don't think we're alone in this, unlike the City of Cambridge that has a robust public health system. And it's one of the accredited, I think, cities along with Boston and Worcester. The rest of us in Chelsea included have a very small department. My department is myself and a public health nurse. So my main role as a director of public health here in the city when I first joined was COVID vaccinations. And it was strategizing and designing a team around really a skeleton crew. So how do we build capacity when we don't have funding and when we don't have a lot of the resources? So we really leverage our relationship with community-based organizations, relationship with faith-based organizations, and really try to incorporate a diverse group of people who would serve as representatives and align ourselves with also medical providers and institutions to really achieve that goal. And together, we created a pipeline that promoted access to vaccinations, also mitigated some of the barriers around language, technology, misinformation, and we met the needs of our residents. So in Chelsea, we transformed the city from one of the a community that was highlighted for having the highest COVID cases to a community that became a role model among the 20 vaccine equity communities for our high vaccination rates achievements. So in building and really taking the lessons learned from COVID is how do we continue this momentum? How do we continue this relationship building? And how do we leverage our assets here in the city? Because we do have assets in designing a robust public health system that is resilient, that can respond and adapt to any future public health challenges, and also build an equitable community to address all the social determinants of health that really led to our residents having a higher burden of COVID cases. So drawing from everything that all the other panelists are saying, because when I look at your communities and see what you've created, it is something that I would want to create here in Chelsea. So I think this is my biggest project yet. And I'm working with a really amazing team here in the city. And I think Green Roots is definitely one of them. And I saw that they will be part of your next conversation. So yes, I'll pass it back to you, Nayeli.
Thanks. So I want to get into a little bit of the questions of that we have around leadership. And being women in municipal leadership is just one part of the many identities that you're bringing to your role. So I'm curious, how have those intersectional identities affected your leadership style, and what new supports are you seeking out, and what challenges are you anticipating in the roles that you have now and in the context that you're all working in? This is an open question to all of you, but I'll pass it to Tiffany first.
It's a really interesting question. And that was actually the first interview question that Michelle asked me when I interviewed for the role. She asked me, what's your leadership style? And it took me a second to think about how to answer insightfully to the mayor about this. So I think what drives my approach to leadership is that, so I've been reading Dr. Brené Brown's work for many years. I think many of you know who she is. She has this wonderful book called Dare to Lead. And one of my favorite insights is that she says, there's not a set of professional values and personal values. We only have one set. We don't shift our values based on context. And conflicts in our lives come in when our values are in conflict with our place of work or our family or, another person. And our values just really don't change in situations. And they are our North Star that guides us through how we move through life. So I like to think of my leadership style as authentic. I wear my heart on my sleeve, which I think I've had to learn how to adapt in a more political environment in meetings I'm in and at City Hall. But usually if I'm feeling an emotion, you can sense it, you can see it on my face. And I think that's kind of the first step to building trust, is when you feel the other person is being authentic with you too. So that at its heart is my leadership style.
Anyone else? Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me to separate my perspective as a woman from other identities, and so I feel like, whether it's as a woman or a white person or a mom or like a ping pong fan, I'm sort of channeling all of that all the time. And but that said, I do think I have some biases that have to do with being a woman and my kind of lived experience. And I echo and resonate with what Tiffany was saying. I think that for me, my leadership style is to try to be, first of all, to just really listen well, and that for me is super important with employees, but it's really important with residents of BHA, to just be able to really hear what they're saying, not, respond too quickly and not, think I know what they're going to say, but to really be able to listen well. And I always, I am biased in that I always favor listeners over talkers, and those that, will respond to a need versus those that maybe are focusing attention on themselves and, maybe favor collaboration over solo glory or whatever. And so, I mean, I think those are things that are arguably come from the the experience of being a woman. Although as soon as you say that, you get it, to me it's sort of a trouble, you get into a little bit of trouble around gender stereotypes as well. And I would also say that for me, I have been really heavily influenced by women leaders. And so, my primary development as a leader, I feel like, has come in interaction with other women leaders. And so for me, representation really has mattered. And, some of the mentors that I've had, been really fortunate to have. I just don't think I would be the leader I am without them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I think, why we're all here today, right? Is to talk about this, the importance of this kind of representation. I'm curious to hear from Flora and Aram as well on this question, maybe thinking as well about, not only your leadership style today, but how it's changed, maybe based on how your job has changed over time.
Maybe I can kick it off. So I have to start with the point you made about intersectionality, and it's hard, as Kate was saying, to tease apart those pieces. So I'm a woman of color, I am a first generation immigrant. All of those, I grew up as a middle class kid whose parents really emphasized education. So I have a mix of privilege and sort of non-dominant components that come together to make who I am today. And each of those things influences the way that I lead. And as Kate was saying, it's really hard to tease apart what influence comes from where, but together we are the sum of all of those parts. And I really like the question that you mentioned about how leadership style evolves over time, because actually I think that certainly changes. I mean, one of the things that I never even questioned as a child was that I was born in India, and the prime minister of the country was Indira Gandhi, right? So this is a woman leader who was running the whole country. I came to this country to go to grad school And there had never been a woman president. And it just, I mean, and there still isn't, right? It's astounding to move from what, and I guess I can say it, what we think of as a third world country to sort of first world developed nation, and find that there is such a dichotomy in terms of the progressive values and where women are able to get to. And that's kind of at a very large scale, but even at organizational scales, and I might be speaking out of school, we've never had a female city manager at the city of Cambridge. This region is at such an incredible place right now. Last week, I met Tiffany for the first time last week when we were at the Green Line opening for the Green Line extension. And one of the most wonderful things about being there was there were 4 women mayors right in one spot. Our entire region is run by women right now. It is such a wonderful moment to be in for the young people who are growing up right now. So I don't think I said a whole lot about my leadership style, but I've talked enough. So I'm just going to turn it over to Flor.
I think I'm just probably going to echo what everyone else has said. I think there was really a really good quote that I heard, that leadership is a set of behaviors, not a role. And it is really how you show up to, as Kate mentioned, to talk to your employees or to talk to your, in her case, her residents. It's the way that you interact with your community. And in order to show up, as Tiffany said, in an authentic way, it's important to also take care of oneself and to ensure that we are the best version of ourselves as we are trying to guide and lead our community, our residents, our, whoever it may be, our colleagues, our team, or building our team in a way so that I think we just present ourselves in a way that it is authentic, and we can do that by being the best version of ourselves and also thinking of ourselves as well and taking care of ourselves, especially in current times where it's easy to just really continue giving and giving. And my definition of leadership, I think, during this time has actually changed, especially because of the uncertainty of times. Before, I would think of leaders as experts in an area, people who would make decision or delegate decisions. And now I'm coming into these roles more with an idea or an aspiration of learning and less of knowing. And I think COVID has really made that surface, because, as far as communications, what are we going to tell our residents? A lot of that has shifted over the course of the pandemic. So in terms of defining leadership, that is one aspect of it that for me has drastically changed, is no longer an expert in an area, but also the ability of someone to be open to learning and sometimes not necessarily having an answer to all of the questions.
Yeah, for sure. So we've been talking a bit about how intersecting identities and like kind of your full identity impacts you at work. And, because of all of the identities that all of us hold, we sometimes experience different biases. And then we also have different biases that we're bringing to work as well. And I'm wondering if you've ever felt or been conscious of and suddenly realized that one of your intersecting identities was impacting the language that you were using at work, or the ideas that you were pushing for, and how you managed that and how you addressed it with your team. I'm going to ask Aram to take it first.
So, you know, I have to say that the example I'm going to give is one that I have just embraced, which is that I do realize that I come from this perspective of just really wanting to support women in leadership and people of color in leadership. I mean, maybe I'll say a sentence about what I should have said in response to your last question, which is one of the things that I believe very strongly in leadership is that your job as a leader, my job as a leader, is to foster leadership in the rest of the organization, is to build other leaders. And I have found that maybe to my chagrin, I noticed that I support women just a little bit more, and people of color just a little bit more in the organization, and help them rise and grow. And I have sometimes questioned whether this is the right thing to do, and have ended up at the place where I feel like it's important, and I'm sticking with it.
Anyone else have a thought about the biases that you're bringing to work, and how you're managing those in addition to the biases that you may be facing? If not, we can move on. Oh, go ahead, Kate.
Well, I would say that, you know, when I took this role, a few months into it, COVID hit, and then things really exploded in terms of Black Lives Matter and a number of really traumatic events in terms of racial violence in our country. And, you know, in both of those things required strong leadership, you know, and I was really aware of that. And also as a white woman, you know, I was conscious that I might not be the best person to lead in that moment, you know. And so I think I really struggled with that and relied on a lot of our employees in that time. I mean, the COVID stuff was different. I sort of went into, you know, action on that. But in terms of what, you know, murders and violence in our Black community and our Asian community brought to the day-to-day work environment here, it really kind of turned us on our head, I feel like. And so I think, you know, for me, I was really aware in that time of, you know, the need to just really have the dialogue and open up the conversation to many perspectives. And, you know, we have a very diverse leadership team, but it's, you know, it really required kind of reaching out at all levels. And I'm not saying that it went perfectly. I'm just giving an example of, you know, when I was aware of an identity, you know, and a lens kind of that was really in play.
That's a really good point. And it actually leads me to one of my last questions that I'll also open up to everybody. We've been talking so much about representation and the importance of representation this evening and its impact, but sometimes it feels, at least to me, like every time we reach to a new level of representation that we're proud of, we learn more, and then we learn more about all the other groups and identities that are still being excluded. So I'm wondering if there's a particular community that may or may not be represented in the room tonight, but who you're consciously thinking about right now in your work, or who you're actively trying to build a relationship with. Maybe Flora, have you thought about that at all?
I have, and also to speak a little bit on your previous question, I do believe that it is hard to disassociate ourselves from our social identities and our lived experience, and both of those will undoubtedly influence the policies and programs that we probably advocate for. And that is an exercise. So an exercise that I try to reflect on all the time is to look at my own power, my own privilege, and my own positionality, and the intersections of all of my identities. And I identify as an immigrant, Latin American, cisgender female, and I can speak to those experiences. And as said, oftentimes you're part of both, potentially the privileged group, and also which may be a dominant group, or an oppressed or a non-dominant group in your area. So as I am thinking of creating and really restructuring the public health system here in Chelsea, I have contemplated my own identities, contemplated who is at the table and who is not at the table, because I think that is what we need to look at. Who right now is missing from the decision-making process. And Chelsea is a primarily Latin American community, and myself being Latin American, I think oftentimes could underrepresent perhaps our Asian community that at one time was flourishing here in Chelsea, but in the last 20 years is not as big or not as large as the Latin American population. We also have other refugees here in the community that we have not yet been able to connect with, but are actively and consciously making steps to be able to communicate with them and ensure that we're not solely looking at the needs of one specific minority group in the community, but looking at all the other ones. And I think the exercise of really assessing our own power, privilege, and positionality has been, at least for me, really effective at identifying who's not at the table.
I really love what Fleur is talking about in terms of really focusing on who is at the table and even more importantly, who isn't. So some of the work that we're doing right now is really trying to focus on the missing pieces. And Jen is very familiar with this because we are creating a community engagement team, learning from one of our sister departments here focused on urban planning. And the groups we are trying to reach are the ones that we have just historically not done a great job of connecting with, and that's linguistic minorities, but it's also the American-born Black community, which their experience has been so challenging that there is a lot of trust building that needs to happen between government and the American-born Black community. So that's something that I feel like we are, personally myself, but also as a department, we are working really hard to double down on and create those connection points.
All right, we can wrap up. I have one last question that I'd actually like to address to all of you as well. As you are thinking about your role as a leader in the organization and where you're currently at, what's an open question that you haven't maybe answered yet, but are hoping to answer in the next phase of your career? I'm curious to hear, we've heard so much about your expertise this evening. I'm curious to hear about what you're still learning. I'll give that to Kate first.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks so much for doing this. I think for me, the learning is just constant, but what I find is that people really, there's a component of spiritual leadership that people are really looking for, in the workplace. And I don't mean in the religious sense, but I mean, they need spiritual support and kind of words of comfort. And I don't know how else to say it. I just feel like it's really striking to me, when I think about, okay, this is the BHA agenda for 2022. And, these are the things we need to get done. And my head is full of those things. And I get uptight when I feel like we're not doing them. But people are they really need another element from work, I think, which is spiritual. And for me, that's something I'm just really learning and developing. And, to be sort of that presence for people and to kind of be there for them in a way that they need, that ultimately allows them to accomplish the work, but it feels really like not work related in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. Aram, what about you? What are you still asking yourself?
Gosh, what I'm asking myself, what I need to learn could, fill the room. Because there is just, the more I learn, the more I realize I need to learn stuff. So I'd say the piece that I am very focused on, both personally and for our organization, is working on how to be an anti-racist organization. How is it that we bring that into practice internally in our interactions with each other, and equally importantly, in our work with the community, so that we are bringing those values that we have. And I know, at least in Cambridge, I think in our whole region, we have the values of diversity, equity, inclusion, to really be able to bring those to life. So that's really where I am doing a lot of work right now.
And how about you, Tiffany? What's an open question for you?
In addition to all the communities that were discussed here, I'm actually really interested in intergenerational communication. And I think this stems from me having a little bit more of a background working at a technology startup where everyone is around the same bucket of years and have similar life experiences. And I think that is really not the majority of the world. And especially now at City Hall, when I know there's been so much work that has been done prior to where we are. I think actually a new administration feels like a new startup, but just like placed on top of a 400-year-old organization, and kind of bridging that gap between new and folks who've been around for a long time and know how things work. And then also age, I think, plays into a lot of people's understanding of what's happening in the room. I'm really interested in getting better at navigating that too.
That's fascinating. And how about you, Flor?
Hi. So I am still learning all the other side jobs and tasks and operations that a public health department is supposed to exercise. So in a day-to-day role, I'm still learning so much about that. But at a more, I think, macro community level, I am learning to be more of an active listener, really taking the information that we're getting from our residents and getting that pulse from our residents to drive our next interventions, what it is that it is most important to our residents, and how we can then continue aligning all together on that one area to make changes and achieve changes. I think oftentimes, a lot of times, I think some of our residents, especially here in Chelsea, may defer to a figure of authority or a figure who may know more. But I think residents are expert in their needs, the same way that when you go to a doctor, the doctor may know so much about other medical conditions, but you're the expert on your body. You know how your body feels and how it's changing. And so really taking that to heart and practicing that here in the community just to build the health of our community. So understanding, listening to what our my community members are saying and what the next steps for Chelsea will be.
Well, thank you all for all of your insightful answers and for being here tonight. I'm going to pass it over to Jen and to Marianne to close us out. Thanks.
Wow, thank you all so much. I'm so grateful I was able to sit through this because I've learned so much and my wheels are now turning with all of the things I would like to start working on. I am going to bring on our board chair, Marianne Ocampo, and she's going to say a few words on behalf of the board of directors.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the board for the Sasaki Foundation. It has been such a pleasure to have everyone in our audience be part of this. It's so inspiring to hear from women in leadership and their different approaches and nuanced ways in which they're working within our communities. It's really inspiring. I want to also thank Nayeli. Special thank you to Nayeli, whose thoughtful questions in moderating this discussion have been really exemplary. Thank you so much, Nayeli. I'm going to let you close it out now.
Well, I have nothing much more to add except for that this recording will be on YouTube in a couple of weeks on the Sasaki Foundation's YouTube channel. And thanks again to our awesome panelists. You are an inspiration to everyone, and we loved having you here tonight. Hope to see you all out and about in Greater Boston soon. Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Bye.